Hello. So we're looking at memory lesson two. We're going to look at the multi-store model of memory. This is a model which is the first model of memory, brings together quite a lot of different things. So let's have a look at this. So first of all, what do you think the picture below has to do with memory? Okay, yeah. So those are all images referring to our senses, and our senses provide a stimulus which comes into our memory. Okay, and we need to remember this. We refer to these as kind of inputs, and they set this inputs into our memory process. We've got to be clear that our memory is not necessarily a how can I put this? When we look at it, we need to be clear that our senses are not a memory store; they're an input. So that's kind of something to sort of bear in mind as we go through and look at this. Um, so we're looking at the very first model of memory. It's the multi-store model of memory by Atkinson and Shiffrin, and it's published in 1968, which, as you probably noticed, was a little time ago. Um, so that's kind of what we're going to be looking at. Also, it's abbreviated MSM, multi-store model of memory, and we're going to be looking to understand that in this session. A quick pointer. What do these notes means? Thursday, Tuesday, Denmark. Well, ultimately, nothing. Nothing to you at this point. That there's not enough depth in them to truly be useful or meaningful later on. What you actually need to do is to make sure when you're taking notes that your note taking is giving you enough detail and depth that actually you retain an understanding of what is going on as you go through, and so that you can look back, 6 months later and still have those notes meaningful to you. I'd like you to look back at your notes, look back at the notes from the start of the course, from any of those. Is there enough depth? Do you need to go back over those and make sure you add some more depth into it? Because after Christmas, you will have a little mock exam there, and you will need to be able to do uh, stuff with the information we've learned already. So you're going to need to have that. Okay, so I recommend you kind of make sure you're using more full sentences, particularly if you've been using like one or two words occasionally. Then just try to up your game. Move forward. The strength of this model is that it is the first. It's the first thing, the first one to ever bring those disparate, separate pieces of information into a model. Now, I asked you at the end of last time to go through and look at and try to piece together that as an idea, but ultimately. Um, ultimately, it's quite a hard thing to do. And what we see with the Atkinson-Shiffrin's model is that while it is the first, while it does give us a kind of basis to work from that, it's not the best. Okay, it's like the Model T Ford. It was the first ever production car. But you know what? It's a terrible car by modern standards. You got to completely service the engine, do all that sort of stuff every 1,000 miles. Yeah, that's incredibly laborious. Modern cars can like 60,000 miles without having had a service, not break down, and that's massively different. But it is the first theory. It's not perfect, but it's a big step forward. Um, so key points about this. It starts off. There's three stores to this. There's sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Now, each of these has a different role to play. It's essential for us to know how that information transfers from each section to the next one and the processes and features of each store. Okay, but also we need to know the structure and the layout. So let's have a look at that. This is literally the model. Okay, so you've got information from our senses, and remember what I said earlier on. Information from our senses is not a store in itself. Okay, that's just where it comes from. So information comes from our senses, so our sight, our hearing. You're hearing me right now. And you're seeing this model right now. So that comes in, and then it comes in as electrical signals, light signals, sound waves, and that has to be transferred into those electrical signals that our brain uses. So it's encoded. It's transferred from one type of information to another. In this case, it's encoded into our sensory memory. When that information's in sensory memory, it only lasts a very short period of time. So we're thinking less than 2 seconds duration in there, but it can hold a massive amount of information. It's also a good idea to kind of think of this as like a funnel, like a filter there, where most information is going to be filtered out, but anything we pay attention to is then folded into our short-term memory. So think about having a conversation with someone when you shouldn't be, and the teacher says your name. All of a sudden, it's because you're then paying attention that you then start hearing what the teacher's saying again when you hear them telling you, what was this question? What's the answer to that? And you're like, oh, I wasn't paying attention beforehand. So yeah, anyway, sensory memory. If you're paying attention to that stimulus, then you will go through and be able to do short-term memory. So in short-term memory, we know a few things about that already. So Miller told us it's 7 plus or minus things, 7 plus or minus 2 things when it came to the old magic number 7. So, but we also have this thing called maintenance rehearsal, which basically says to keep it in our short-term memory in an active thing, we need to carry out what's referred to as maintenance rehearsal, which is basically putting it through that rehearsal loop again and again and again to keep it fresh in our mind. If we do that enough, and it's within that sort of 30 seconds, and it's not being pushed out by something else, then we can transfer it over into our long-term memory. Long-term memory is really important. It's where obviously we hold most information, but it's not an active store in that way. It's not somewhere we process and do lots of things with. So if we need to do something, if we need to kind of work something out, we actually have to retrieve that information back into our short-term memory, which is a very active store, which enables us to kind of put things together and form an output. So, sorry, let's go through and do a quick demonstration of this. I'm going to ask you, what is 2 plus 2? Go ahead, go on, quick. Right, yeah, not funny. I'm betting that you guys were able to go, oh, the answer is this. But let's do a slow action replay. Okay, so information, in this case sound waves, comes through your ears and is encoded into our sensory information. You're paying attention to me, of course you're paying attention to me. And so that information is passed straight on to short-term memory. Short-term memory goes, 2 plus 2. I know that. So it goes and it pulls from long-term memory your 2 times table, which you learn at primary school, or maybe even before. So it pulls it in and goes, that's the answer. Right, okay. And then forms an auditory response, at which point it outputs it. And you said? Hopefully you just said 4. If you said 5, then go back to primary maths. But yeah, okay, you see how that works? Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to use the textbook now. I'd like to sketch out that model as well, because you need to have the visual of it as well. But also I'd like you to go through and then use this table and use the textbook, and I'd like you to make notes of the following parts of the model. So the sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. I want you to know about, have a little description of each one. In it, you need to state the duration, the capacity, the coding type as well. Okay, that's really, really important. Okay, so can you go through and do that, and then click play again on the video. Thank you. Okay, so I'm trusting that you've done that. this is now the answers. Let's go through. So first of all, sensory memory is the first store. Comes information comes into the senses. It's a high capacity but low duration, meaning it's most information is lost due to a lack of attention. There's a variety of studies here, but the moisture model memory is, first of all, it's claiming it's up to half a second. Capacity is many items. Basically, it's too brief for us to really know, but we kind of recognize it's processing more than we can kind of really even realize. But the duration makes it kind of problematic. Coding type of information is iconic, which stores information visually, and we have an echoic store, which stores the information acoustically. So we have like two little subsystems within our sensory memory. One's iconic, one's echoic, each doing their relevant job there. Moving on to short-term memory. This one should be a little bit more familiar. We've covered that a little bit. So the second store, which has an active attention, and which is where we form our responses and solve problems. Important that's a big thing. As well as process information through rehearsal for storage of long-term memory. Don't forget that it solves problems there. It lasts up to 30 seconds. Different research has shown those things there. We know that Peterson kind of supported up to 18 seconds, but they claim up to 30 seconds. They are in line with Miller and his study there. So, oh look, that means Miller is a supportive study for this. So Miller's magic number 7 is a direct support for this element of the theory. So we've learned a support study already. Brilliant. It stores information acoustically, how it sounds. Okay, and again, if we look back, we'll see that we've already done a study in which it shows the different ways in which information is stored and processed. So again, that's a second study which we've already learned, which is support for this, our multi-store model of memory. Fantastic. Long-term memory. So the third store, keeping information for long-term storage, can both store and retrieve information. It lasts a lifetime. It's unlimited when it comes to the capacity. Brilliant. Not unlimited duration, because sadly our memories only last as long as we're alive. It also, the coding, it stores information acoustically, semantically, which means by meaning. Okay, so acoustically is short term, long term is semantically, based on meaning. But how do we forget things? Because we do, don't we? So this is like a adaptation. This is adding on the model. Let's have a look. So there's the model. Well, first of all, we can lose information by it decaying before we pay attention to it in our sensory memory. So things you haven't been paying attention to don't even get processed. So for instance, I want you to think about your posterior right now. Think about your bum. Okay, you've been having that sensation of the pressure of your body weight onto your bum, onto the seat, since you sat down. Okay, it's been there the whole time. You've just not been paying attention to it, and so that information has been decaying in your short-term in your sensory memory before being processed, never getting to your short-term memory. Okay, now you're paying attention to it, now it's getting to your short-term memory. Sorry guys. All right, let's look at short-term memory. Well, short-term memory, we know, gets full. Okay, 7 plus or minus 2, so between 5 to 9 items. And so one or two things can happen. Either information gets pushed out before it's transferred by new incoming information, or decays before it's passed on. So simply put, either it gets pushed out before it's been processed, or it doesn't quite fit in, and so it decays. There's not enough space for it, so it decays on that because the short-term memory is currently full. And finally, in long-term memory, and this is one of the things this is a big thing when it comes to understanding revision and the way in which you should revise. We normally have in a long-term memory two different issues. One accessibility, i.e. we lose the connection to the memory, so we cannot access it, so in which case we need to build stronger links. Or 2, we have availability issues, so the memory of it itself is lost, so cannot be recalled. So we either lose the memory itself, and that fades away in our long-term memory because it's not been activated recently enough, or we lose the connection to it, so we can't access it. So in our revision, we have to make it frequent and regular, because it's about making sure that availability is maintained, and also we need to work on accessibility. So by thinking about things and building connections in our head, we build up multiple connections and make sure we don't forget that information we need. Evidence for and against. Well, we've got some case studies, and I'd like you to sort of watch this little video about Clive Waring. Very famous case study by Warrington. Although, according to Clive, he's never seen a doctor, never seen a psychologist or anyone. They're totally pointless, totally worthless. But we have the case of HM, who kind of proves the separation of the different elements in his brain, or short-term and long-term memory, and so does Clive. So I'd like you to use a textbook, but I'd also like you to watch that clip to kind of work out why it is Clive is a support for this. I'll ask that question when we get back in. Difference between short-term memory and long-term memory, the serial positioning curve by Glanson and Knitz. Now, I will draw this for you on the board when we get back in, but basically, Glanson and Knitz do a standard 20-question memory test, and in one condition they get to recall it straight away, and he plots where they come, and then in the second condition he does a delay task which prevents them from being able to recall straight away, and so by the time they get a chance to recall, their short-term memory is empty. It doesn't have information. And again, he plots it there. And what we see is that while initially both groups are able to recall a reasonable amount of words, it gradually tails off. As you get like to 5, 6, it's getting lower, the accuracy of recall. But then for the ones who had immediate recall, as we come towards the end of those 20 words, we find that people start again remembering those. So the last 5, 6 tend to actually be remembered pretty well, because their short-term memory is still holding on to them. But the ones who are given the delay task, they don't have that short-term memory. So, as such, it's gone. Okay? KF and Shias and Warrington. KF has an issue that basically he is able to process visual information, but he cannot process auditory information. Now, the Moisture model memory can't explain this. In theory, all information is processed in the short-term memory and in the long-term memory. There's no separate information for visual and for auditory. So that's a problem for this. It's actually support for our next theory, which kind of takes that into account. But when it comes to Shias and Warrington study, or KF, or as I refer to it frequently as KFC, because KF can see, i.e. he can process visual information, but not auditory, it shows us that there must be more sort of separation of these things than others. Craig and Watkins also show that actually rehearsal can happen in many different ways, and that there's more than one way to rehearse things. This one I've just sort of broken down there for you. So that's the Glanson and Knitz, because it's not in the textbook, I don't think. So please do make a note particularly of that one on there. Okay. I'll just click on to the next one. You can pause the video now, but I'm going to click on to the next one, relative strengths and weaknesses. So strength of this one brings together this previously ununified research into a unified model, which we can then understand and we can then start to test. Okay. Secondly, it provides a framework of 3 memory stores, which evidence seems to be well supported that there is that separation of memory stores. And thirdly, it allows for psychologists to devise further studies to test the ideas that are being brought forward. And that's yeah, it's a good set of strengths. But the simple fact is there's a serious lack of detail over how each part really works. So short-term memory is said to solve problems. But how? How does it do that? Both also short-term and long-term don't seem to be just one store each. So fingers crossed, there must be something else. So we'll find out later in our next theory. But yeah, so simply put, there is those things there. And we can actually use that next theory that we're going to learn about as a criticism for this theory, which is a really strong thing to do. Okay, so we're going to do that one more strongly next time. Then third, we've got ideas of rehearsal versus processing. Some people come up with this idea that it's about the level of processing, about how deeply you process something, not about how you process it. It's called the levels of processing theory, and it's a completely different way of looking at memory. And it challenges this there. So not everyone is thinking the same way is kind of what we're seeing here. And finally, there is arguments to say that short-term memory and long-term memory might not be really that separate. We have arguments around that in which we look at these different ones. So basically what they've done is a classic science thing. They've created a theory to answer some questions, and in doing so created a lot more questions that then need answering. So classic science, we're going to then go on and do it. Okay, let's look at some classic exam questions around this one. So we might have how does information pass from one store to another? So in this case, I've put short term to long term, 2 marks. So you need to say what it is and explain it very briefly. Describe sensory memory. So sensory memory, again, we're looking at those things. You probably try and give a few features of it. So you include things such as I don't know, the capacity, the duration. Yeah, that makes sense. Then we've got to describe one strength, and we could also have one that describe one weakness of the multi-store memory. Now, please note that's not asking for a support. Yeah, and I separate out these strengths and weaknesses from the supportive evidence and from the critical evidence, because I want you to kind of start recognizing this, particularly when it comes to theories. We might have a strength of a theory, which is the way in which it deals with things, the way in which it brings things together. So, for instance, the way in which the multi-store model memory brings together all these different ideas into a cohesive model. That's a strength. Yet, a weakness is the fact that it fails to accommodate all the different aspects of memory effectively. So that's a weakness. Whereas a criticism would be the KF study, which rejects the notion that would be a criticism, not a weakness. Okay, so they are different. We do need to start picking that up as we go through. Finally, I've put a nice simple describe and evaluate question there for multi-store model memory. That's come up several times. I will ping you a model for this one as well. So let's have a quick look. What might we look to include? Well, in the area 1, we're doing a little plan there, 175 words, 6 marks. We need to cover about the sensory memory, short-term memory, long-term memory, coding capacity, duration, process through the MSM. Yeah, if we do that, we're going to smash it. Then when it comes to evaluation, I recommend 3 evaluation points really is going to be enough. So we can look at the Clive Waring with Warrington. How does that have support for the separate stores for short-term memory, long-term memory? We can then give that counterpoint saying, yeah, actually short-term memory seems to be broken down into auditory and visual, which this theory doesn't seem to explain or demonstrate. And then finally, we've got Tolving's pointing out there's different parts for the long-term memory. And actually, on our next thing we're going to look at Tolving's theory for the long-term memory, and we can use that to criticize the fact that actually multi-model memory doesn't break down long-term memory into the different parts, and that's something it fails to achieve. Okay. So how do we do it? Well, as I say, describe the information as it passes through the systems, describe the process there, describe each store, making sure you talk about its features and then its methods of transfer. When it comes to evaluation, give 1 or 2 supporting points, say why it's a support, give 1 or 2 critical studies, say why it's a criticism, say a strength, explaining fully, say 2 weaknesses, explaining. All those are things that you would want to do. So here is an example of that essay being written. Here is color coded up and all the things bolded out with some underlining of those keywords. Then hopefully by looking at that you can kind of see how this comes together as an answer. Okay, so when we look at it, well, we see this, it's quite well detailed. There is occasionally actually there's 1 or 2 little bits which I deliberately either left out or didn't include or not there. So it's mostly effective when it comes to the evaluation points. There's definitely some valid points there, but we could tweak the language a little bit more to make it just a little more effective at times. It's clear and adherent generally though, and again, because with that language points which were part of that evaluation, because it wasn't quite where we wanted it, I'd say that's mostly used effectively on there, which means that it's good knowledge with clear and effective structure, relevant critical points, some more developed depth, possible description, criticism to boost for the final mark. But it's done well. It's been given a band 3 and it's given 12 out of 16 for that. Not quite sure that's not quite lined up as it should have. So yeah, that's a demonstration of that on there. Homework: create your own visual representation of the multi-store model memory. There's 15 marks. Accuracy for 5, style for 5, originality for 5 as well. Okay, so you're going to get that. I want you to do it. I'm going to give you a week. I would like you to complete that as soon as you have the chance, so maybe over the weekend, and then bring it in for next Friday's lesson. Thank you very much.